The air in the apothecary's shop was thick with the scent of drying herbs, a familiar musk of sage, lavender, and thyme hanging in the dimly lit space. It was a sanctuary for me, a place where I, Thomas, apprentice to Master Grayer, spent my days grinding roots and mixing potions, far removed from the politics of the court and the whispered secrets of the king's alchemist. My hands were stained green from the day's work, but my mind lingered on a darker, more sinister stain, one that had begun to seep into every corner of the kingdom. It started quietly, like all insidious things do. Rumors swept through the market about an elixir crafted by the court alchemist Aramis, a potion so powerful it could grant eternal youth and vitality. They said it had been tested on animals first, then on prisoners from the dungeons, men long forgotten whose lives could be snuffed out without consequence, and then finally, it had been given to the king. King Thaddeus had ruled for decades, his once great strength diminished by age. I had only ever known him as an old man, frail and hunched beneath the weight of his crown. But after the elixir? Well, they said he rose from his sickbed like a man half his age, his eyes sharp and gleaming, his posture straight and tall. The transformation was undeniable, they said, and soon word of this miracle spread beyond the castle walls. But what the people didn't know, or didn't care to know, was the cost of such power. I learned of it by accident, overhearing a conversation not meant for my ears. Master Grayer had been summoned to the castle to deliver some rare ingredients, and I accompanied him as his apprentice. As we passed through the narrow stone halls of the castle, we came upon Aramis, speaking in low tones with the captain of the King's Guard. "It requires more," Aramis whispered, his eyes darting to and fro. "Much more. Yes, but it must be fresh. The longer we delay, the less potent the elixir becomes." The captain scowled, his voice a gruff rumble. "You'll have your corpses. The dungeons are full." Aramis shook his head violently. "No, no, not the prisoners. Their blood is tainted with disease, with despair. It must be the innocent, the pure. The elixir draws its strength from their vitality, their unspoiled essence. The king demands it." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The king's youth, his renewed vigor, it came from the blood of the innocent. It was unthinkable, a crime against the natural order, and yet, as I looked to Master Grayer, I saw no surprise in his eyes, only the cold resignation of a man who knew too much. From that day on, the whispers grew louder. People began to disappear. Farmers, merchants, children. The elves of the southern slopes abandoned their homes and retreated to their great forest. Always a wise people, perhaps they could see where the rule of King Thaddeus would lead. Our own people would vanish in the night, their homes left undisturbed, their lives erased as if they had never existed. The city grew tense, a palpable fear settling over its streets, and yet the king thrived. I returned to the apothecary with a growing sense of dread. Master Grayer never spoke of what we had overheard, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He worked feverishly, mixing potions late into the night, though I knew not for whom. It was as if he were preparing for something terrible. Then, one evening, the summons came. The king himself had requested Master Grayer's presence at the castle. "You will accompany me, Thomas," Master Grayer said, his voice tight with unease. The king, he grows impatient." We arrived at the castle under the cover of darkness. The air was cold, and a thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around the base of the walls like ghostly fingers. Inside, the halls were eerily silent, save for the distant echo of our footsteps. Aramis met us in the grand hall, his face pale and drawn. He led us to the throne room, where King Thaddeus sat, resplendent in his newfound youth. His eyes were sharp and predatory, gleaming with an unnatural light. "I have need of you, Greya," the king said, his voice smooth and commanding. "Aramis has done well, but the supply is dwindling. We need more." Master Greya bowed stiffly. "Your Majesty, I am but a humble apothecary. I do not possess the knowledge of such alchemy." "Then learn," the king snapped, his eyes narrowing as his gaze shifted between my master and Aramis. They both bowed to their liege, fearful of drawing any more anger from him. I stood back in the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. The king's words were like a blade, sharp and threatening. Master Greya had no choice but to comply, and so did I. We were bound to the crown by fear, by the knowledge of the horrors that lurked beneath the surface. As we left the throne room, Aramis pulled Master Greya aside, whispering frantically, "The dead do not rest, Greya. I feel their eyes upon me, their breath on my neck. The more we take, the more they stir. We must be careful." Master Greya said nothing, but I saw the fear in his eyes. The next few weeks were a blur of horrors. More people disappeared, their bodies never found, but I knew where they went. Dragged to the castle, their blood drained for the king's elixir. Aramis and his dark magics kept the king alive, but at a terrible cost. And then, the dead began to rise. It started with whispers in the market, sightings of figures moving in the fog, their skin gray and lifeless. At first no one believed it, but soon the sightings became too frequent to ignore. Bodies that had been buried in the churchyard were found missing from their graves, the earth disturbed as if they had clawed their way out. One night, I awoke to the sound of scratching at my window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly I crept to the window and peered out into the street. There, in the pale moonlight, stood a figure, a man, or what had once been a man. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and hollow. He stared at me with empty, accusing eyes. I felt a cold terror wash over me. Just then a rotting hand slammed against my window, tapping on the glass once again. I slammed the shutters closed. Stumbling backwards, I fell into my bed, my heart racing. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting. After a few moments, the tapping stopped. It must have moved on. But there was no doubt the dead were rising, and they were angry. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, unable to sleep, listening to shuffling sounds in the street. The next morning, the city was in chaos. The dead roamed the city, their numbers vast. They attacked the living with a terrifying hunger, their cold, rotting hands reaching out to drag their victims into the grave with them. I'm ashamed to say that for the next few days, I helped to make the elixir, even knowing its foul secrets. As the numbers of roaming dead grew, the king's guard kept the streets clean. For a time, but it wasn't long before they were overwhelmed, some by the sheer numbers of dead, others by their disgust at what they were witnessing. As the guards dwindled, the king did nothing. He remained locked in his castle, hidden away behind stone walls and what few guards remained, while the rest of us suffered. Yet Aramis, Master Greyer, and yes, even I, worked tirelessly to keep the elixir flowing. It was never enough. The king's thirst for immortality was insatiable, and the more he took, the more the dead rose to take their revenge. One evening I was mixing a new batch in the apothecary, as the door burst open and a figure stumbled inside. It was a young woman, her face pale and her clothes torn. She collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. "Help me," she whispered, her voice weak. "They're coming. They're coming for us all." I rushed to her side. Before I could respond, the door was thrown open again, and the cold air of the night rushed in. Standing in the doorway were 3 figures, pale, lifeless, their eyes empty and cold. They stepped into the shop, their movements slow and deliberate, like puppets on strings. I grabbed a vial of acid from the counter and hurled it at them, but it did nothing. They kept coming, their dead eyes fixed on me. I could feel the cold of the grave emanating from them, and I knew that no weapon, no potion could stop them. They were the victim of the king's greed, the innocent souls whose blood had been stolen, and now they had returned to take it back. The woman screamed, and the dead lunged at her. I tried to pull her away, but they were too strong. Their hands closed around her throat, and I could hear the sickening crunch of bone as they crushed the life out of her. I ran. I had no choice. The dead were relentless, and I knew that if I stayed, I would join them in their cold, lifeless existence. I fled through the streets, the cries of the living and the dead echoing in my ears. The city was in ruins, the dead tearing through the streets like a plague. I could see them everywhere, clawing their way out of the ground, staggering through the fog, their eyes empty and hungry. I had to get to the castle. The king was the cause of all this. If I could stop him, maybe, just maybe, I could end this nightmare. The castle gates were open when I arrived, the guards either dead or fled. I made my way through the halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The throne room doors were ajar, and as I stepped inside, I saw him, King Thaddeus, sitting on his throne, his once youthful face now twisted and monstrous. His skin was pale and stretched, his eyes black and hollow. "Aramis," I called out, my voice trembling. "Greyer?" No answer, only the cold, oppressive silence. The king turned his head slowly, his eyes fixing on me. "More," he demanded. "I need more." "You've taken enough," I said, stepping forward. "Look at what you've done. The dead walk the streets. They're coming for you." The king laughed, an ear-piercing, maniacal howl. "They can't touch me. I am eternal." But even as he spoke, I could see the truth. His body was failing, despite all the elixir he had taken. It had kept him alive, but his hunger for immortality had turned him into something less than human. And then I heard it, a low moaning sound, growing louder and louder. The dead had followed me. They were coming. The doors behind me creaked open, and the dead began to pour into the throne room. Their eyes were fixed on the king, their hands outstretched, their hunger palpable. I backed away, watching as the king rose from his throne, his fearlessness in the face of this onslaught revealing a certain madness. "No," he ordered, his voice stronger than it had any right to be. No, you cannot have me. I am your king. Of course, the dead didn't care. They surrounded him, their cold hands closing in, dragging him from his throne and into the depths of the grave where he belonged. I ran. I didn't look back. The last thing I heard was the king's scream, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The kingdom of Corthos was lost. Its people, its sovereign, its future, all consumed by the greed of one man. And I, Thomas, the lowly apothecary's apprentice, was left to wander the ruins of a kingdom that had once thrived, now reduced to a barren wasteland. But even as I left the city behind, I knew one thing for certain. The dead do not forgive, nor do they forget.